Joining me now, Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor, the co-host of Pod Save the World, and an MSNBC political contributor. Welcome, Ben. Always glad to talk with you. First, I want to get your reaction to the German election results that we're seeing that Ralph was just talking about. Look, we see the center-right CDU, that's the Christian Democratic Union, win, but the far-right AfD, it close to doubled its votes from the last election. What does this mean for the future of Germany's government and more broadly, Ben, Europe?
Well, Alex, it tracks what we saw in the public opinion polling, which is certainly a shift to the right in Germany. And I think there are a couple of pieces to that. The first is, Germans are upset by cost of living, just like people in the United States were. They're upset about immigration, just like people in the United States were. So there's not a huge surprise that the incumbent party, the Social Democrats, lost, and you had the CDU, which was, the party of Angela Merkel, win in this election. However, the other factor here is that this is a movement to the right, more consequentially in Germany than we've seen before. So first of all, the CDU moved to the right from Angela Merkel. Merz is to her right on issues like immigration. But the AfD, people need to understand the United States. There are leaders in the AfD who've been deemed extremists by German authorities themselves. This is a party that has roots that date back to kind of neo-Nazism. They've called into question accounts of the Nazi Party and of the Holocaust. So this is essentially a party that has been ostracized from the German mainstream, now reaching 20%. And I think that speaks to a kind of growing far-right politics across Europe, that is going to make it harder for Europe to speak with one voice at precisely the time that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump and others are seeking to divide Europeans against one another. So I think what we're seeing is a kind of fracturing of European politics as you see these far-right movements grow, not growing all the way to gain power in big countries like Germany and France, but knocking on the door. And that's going to make it harder for Europe to stick together on issues like Ukraine. And obviously that's happening at a crisis point for Ukraine when we have the President of the United States essentially switching sides to take Russia's view of that conflict.
Well, let's remind our viewers that Elon Musk endorsed the AFU. He said, great, there you go. It is a pretty extraordinary. Actually, the AFD is what it is. Let me talk about what happens tomorrow, which is French President Emmanuel Macron visits the White House to meet with President Trump. I'm curious what you expect from this meeting, what it will look like given Trump's recent attacks on President Zelensky and on the aid to Ukraine and his envoys criticizing Europe.
Well, yeah, I think what you've seen from Emmanuel Macron since Trump made this outreach to Russia, since J.D. Vance flew to Munich, Alex, and endorsed the AfD and further kind of stirred the pot in European politics, you saw Emmanuel Macron have an emergency summit of European leaders to try to muster support for Ukraine. Now, both Europe and Ukraine have been iced out of the key negotiations thus far. The U.S. has been negotiating bilaterally with Russia. So Macron brought together European leaders. He said that both French and British troops might be on the ground in Ukraine as part of a peace settlement to provide a security guarantee to the Ukrainians that has not been forthcoming from the United States. I think what Macron would want is essentially a pledge from Trump that Europe and Ukraine can be at the negotiations about the end of the war in Ukraine, which is not an unreasonable demand. Europe has provided more support to Ukraine than the United States has, and obviously the Ukrainians are the ones fighting and dying on the front lines. The question for us, Alex, is will we see Donald Trump work with Macron, try to bring him and the Europeans into the fold as it relates to the end of the war in Ukraine? Or will we see him talk down to Macron? Will we see him continue to express a preference for these dictatorial leaders like Vladimir Putin that seem to be more in line with Trump's view of the world? I think the entire world is waiting to see whether these two leaders find common ground or whether Europe continues to be on the outs in this White House.
Mm-hmm. Monday is a sobering day as it marks 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, and we are in early stages of possible peace talks. But Trump this week alone has gone from calling Zelensky a dictator and blaming Ukraine for starting the war to then later saying Russia attacked Ukraine and then pushing for a mineral agreement to be signed as some sort of a payback for U.S. aid already given and a down payment on support in the future, we hope. I don't know that that's been made perfectly clear, though. What do you make of Trump's shifting stance?
Well, I mean, he's viewing this as some kind of transaction where he wants to repair relations with Russia. He's obviously had this affinity for Putin. He's been essentially putting forward Russian talking points about how the war started, but also Russian proposals. The idea that Ukraine should somehow have an election while they're being bombarded by Russia is very much a Russian desire because it would destabilize Ukrainian politics. Trump seems to be trying to pressure Zelensky into signing this deal, which I'm just going to say, Alex, is completely grotesque to me. The idea that a country that is fighting for its survival is being essentially told by the United States of America that the only way that will include you in negotiations about your future, the only way that will provide any support to you whatsoever is if you sign over your rare earth minerals to us. That's just kind of not the kind of leadership that people expect from the United States of America, but that is what we're getting from the kind of transactionalism of Donald Trump. I think what worries me here, Alex, is essentially what Trump is pushing for is an end of the war completely on Russia's terms. They get to keep about 20% of Ukraine's territory. There's no NATO membership for Ukraine, so they continue to be vulnerable to Russian invasion in the future. And what? So that we can get some rare earth minerals from Ukraine? I don't think that's exactly the game changer of the United States that Donald Trump seems to think it is. Meanwhile, underneath that, the whole world order is unraveling. U.S. alliances are unraveling. Europe is fracturing. Russia is going to be emboldened. China is going to be emboldened. You have Taiwan looming as another place in which a big country, China, may seek to take action against Taiwan. You have Russia threatening other countries in Europe. So it has to be seen in that context. And that's why it feels like such a dangerous moment that the United States is abandoning any sense of moral high ground, but also seems to be empowering this collection of autocratic countries from China to Russia to Saudi Arabia, who hosted the talks between the U.S. and Russia. So it's a very uncertain moment, Alex, right now.
Yeah, it is. Let me get a question in on Israel, because in just the last hour, we have learned that Israeli tanks have moved into the occupied West Bank. It's for the first time in decades. So with the defense minister saying troops will remain in parts of the territory for a year and tens of thousands of Palestinians who have fled can't return, what do you make of this escalation by Israel?
Well, I think it's connected to what we were just talking about in a way, because obviously the attention's been focused on Gaza. There continues to be the question of who will administer Gaza. Will Israel continue to have kind of a security presence in Gaza going forward? But the West Bank has always been, territorially at least, the main event. And there are people in Netanyahu's coalition in the far right in Israel who would like to begin to annex parts of the West Bank. Not only continuing settlement building, but taking greater security presence in the West Bank and potentially move to annexation. And again, if we're moving to this world in which the rules don't apply, in which might makes right, in which things like sovereignty and international norms and rules and laws don't apply anymore, I think the West Bank is an area that we have to watch very closely. Because if you're in the Israeli far right, you're probably thinking there's not going to be a better opportunity for us to try to seize and claim and potentially annex territory than the 4 years of Donald Trump's second term. And so I think we're in for a pretty bumpy and uncertain ride when it comes to the West Bank in the coming months and years, as well as this uncertainty around the future of Gaza.
I always appreciate our conversations, Ben Rhodes. Come see me again soon. Thank you.